Thank you everyone for coming along. This is our last main speech of the day before we all go back to the main rooms and have our afternoon tea. So I just really wanted to extend a really big thank you to Tim Peel coming out to present. He's talking about post-contact and kind of what happens after a breach. And I think we've had a lot of good speeches coming out of Okta over the past few years. I believe it was 2 years ago, they came in and talked about their own breach in quite a lot of details, and it was really, really insightful. So I think we're going to get some really insightful stuff out of Tim today, and I think it's something that we'll get a lot out of. So can I get a really massive round of applause for Tim?
Thank you very much. All right. Please let me introduce myself. So my name's Tim Peel. I'm the Director of Threat Analysis and Research at Okta. I've got a global team. I've got 7 at the moment, growing pretty rapidly at the moment. We sit within Okta's cyber defense group inside security. So I'm not here to sell you something today. I have been at Okta now for about just coming on 4 years. I've been in the industry doing cyber threat intelligence for something like 15, worked in the intelligence community, finance, technology, a little bit of everything in that time. My threat analysis and research teams do a number of different things. There's 3 teams under that group, but essentially everything from cyber threat intelligence through to purple teaming and targeted threat research. Essentially, you can think of this as my team looks to try and understand what threat actors are going to do to perhaps target Okta or to target our customers. All right, so today I want to talk to you a little bit about a threat actor that we've been tracking for a number of years now called Scatterswine. You might know them by their more popular name these days, which is Scattered Spider. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit today about an organisation known, or a community I should say, known as the COM, because it's really central to understanding who these guys are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about their initial access playbooks and how they actually compromise targets. I'll also talk shortly about post-compromise activity and what they do after that. Then I'm going to describe some research that we've done internally, collaboratively here at Okta, to understand what kind of configuration changes some of our customers are doing after they've been targeted by this particular group. Our hope is here to give you a little bit of insight into what you can potentially do to protect yourself by understanding what others who've been targeted by a pretty prolific threat actor like this do when they're targeting others. We'll talk a little bit about recommendations, and then I'll give you some final thoughts. Can I ask for a show of hands? Can you raise your hands if you're actually an Okta customer here today? Cool. All right, thank you. The thing I want to assure everyone else in the room that didn't raise their hands is that I am going to talk about Okta. I'm going to talk about the Okta product a little bit, but this is not a talk about how to set up your Okta org to protect yourself. This is insights that we hope are valuable to anyone here, regardless of whether you're using Okta or any other identity service. All right, so Scatterswine. This is a threat actor that we've been tracking since about early 2022. They're interesting, they are very aggressive, they are very, very good at social engineering. They're very good at targeting and moving laterally and exploiting access inside modern zero-trust environments. This is a group that essentially specialises in that, if that makes sense. They can operate effectively in malwareless intrusions, so they can operate in intrusions where they don't need to drop malware on the end devices at all. They are very good at understanding how modern enterprises are using SaaS applications, and they're very good at going after data in those environments. Having said that, they're also very happy to use malware, and we've seen them morphing more to a methodology where they're happy to drop ransomware into an environment, and that's something that's made a fair few headlines in the last 12 months, certainly. So what I'd say about their playbooks, they are relatively static when it comes to their initial access, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. They have a technique that works for them. They're heavily social engineering focused, and they've gained notoriety for that. Their post-incident, what they're doing post-compromise can change vastly. It doesn't they're more than happy to adapt and work out how to monetize access once they've got it. And we'll talk a bit and show you a little bit of what that looks like as well. In terms of their targets, Scattered Swine or Scattered Spider love to go after BPO companies, business process outsourcing. If you're unfamiliar with that term, a lot of larger organisations outsource things like their first point of contact with a customer for customer support. This is something that software companies do a lot, but also insurance companies, etc. Think about help desks, but also just that frontline customer support services. Companies are paying these companies. They give them their run books and their playbooks on how to answer particular questions from a customer and then escalate through to the company themselves as they need it. Gambling companies, MGM and Caesars, are two major properties that had a pretty nasty involvement with these guys earlier this year, leading to huge amount of downtime and outages for them and significant costs. If we look at technology companies, Twilio was targeted by these guys to pretty dramatic effect as well. What I'd say about this list here is that we've got a mixture here of final targets for these guys that they've actually gone after directly to monetize that access, but also a number of companies that they've gone after deliberately to initiate follow-on attacks. Twilio is a great example of that. These guys think about supply chains. In the case of Twilio, if you're not familiar with them, Twilio, one of their major things that they do in the industry is they are providing SMS telephony services. So any of these applications that you're using that are sending you an SMS OTP code for you to log in, many of them are going through Twilio. So if you can get access to Twilio's backend, you can potentially be able to intercept those OTP codes before they get sent. And that's essentially what they did in that intrusion. That intrusion impacted Okta directly. The interesting thing about that intrusion, and it gives you a little bit of a sense with supply chain about how you're only really seeing the tip of the iceberg a lot of time, they went after and looked at the data of 209 customers of Twilio. As far as I'm aware, only Okta, Signal, and DoorDash publicly acknowledged that they were impacted at all. So it's actually a huge amount of customers that got impacted there that nobody had any idea about and probably never will, to be frank. All right, when we talk about initial access, these guys grew up cutting their teeth on SIM swapping. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Purchase credentials from the dark web. This is something that these guys are also very good at. They're using, this is malware like Redline, Stealer, Vidar, these commodity malwares that are distributed by many different methods. Why, if you're going after a target, what harm is there in jumping onto one of those dark web markets and seeing if you've got creds or cookies for some of those particular targets already? Why go to the trouble of setting up your own phishing infrastructure if that stuff's there? And these guys have definitely used that in many cases. If they can't find that and they want to go after a target, they'll set up their own phishing sites. In the past, originally, when we first encountered them, they were making pretty basic cred harvesting static websites. As time went on, they're now using adversary in the middle proxies to be able to inline grab session tokens and things like that. Much more effective phishing technique. In a lot of cases, the user has no idea that they've even had their data taken in those. And then push fatigue. I don't want to labour this one too much. A lot of people have talked about this over the last few years. It is true that in some environments, if you are configuring your apps to send constant push notifications to your users, you can train them to have a bit of a Pavlovian response to that, where they're going to be just hitting accept regardless of what's in front of them. A lot of the time, there's applications running in the background that a session's gone out of time for, and it's going to pop a push notification for them to approve it. They don't even know what it is in a lot of cases, and people are just going to hit that button until it stops annoying them. So certainly it is a technique that works more than I would like. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about their social engineering. It's very, very high quality. This is something that I really wanted to talk to people about, to let you think about what makes sense. Would these attacks and these approaches work in your environment? There's a tendency, I think, to assume that criminal groups, if they were to perform direct social engineering of your organisation, that it'd be pretty easy to spot. I'm not talking about phishing, emails. I'm talking about someone actually ringing your employees up, ringing your support lines up, and talking directly to a user in those environments. The reality is that these guys, when they call your service desk, they're going to sound exactly like your employees. They've done a lot of work in trying to understand your environment. They'll understand the tools that you use. They'll try to understand the people. I was only talking to a customer yesterday, in fact, who was telling me about a call very much like this. And he was saying that when they went back and had a look at it, they realised that this threat actor had been calling their support desk for a couple of weeks now on multiple occasions. And what they'd been doing each time they'd had those conversations, the first ones, they weren't after anything in particular. They weren't trying to compromise the organisation. What they were trying to do was extract more information. So they were asking dumb questions. You know, hey, I'm a new starter in the company. I don't know how to log on. Where am I getting this information from? And those questions are being answered. They're getting more of an understanding. Okay, these guys use Confluence to store their data. They're using Snowflake for their databases, whatever it might be. They're getting all this information, they're gathering it together, and it's giving them a sheet that they can work from in the future when they call up to really go after you. They're also really adept at posing as your support staff. So this again is something that's really worth keeping in mind. They will ring up your employees directly, sometimes on their personal devices, sometimes on work phones, and they will give you, they've got very good at developing their pretext. So they might ring you up and say, hey, we've noticed a problem with your account. We're trying to troubleshoot it, but I'm having trouble understanding what's going on. Can you try logging onto this application for me? And again, it's going to be very, very convincing. A lot of your users are going to potentially are not going to be able to spot this. All right. Okay, that reads pretty well on this screen. I wasn't sure if you'd be able to see this or not. I'll talk about this in a moment. But who are these guys? Attribution with this particular group can get really murky really quickly. There are a number of groups tracked in research and law enforcement circles that are loosely affiliated with an online community called the COM. This is a cybercrime group or community that has been going for a number of years now. I mentioned before that they started out in SIM swapping. They originally, their whole meaning of what they were trying to do was to go after social media accounts and try and compromise ones that they wanted to go after. So Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, etc. The way they do this was with SIM swapping. They got very, very good at ringing up or walking in physically to telco stores in America usually, but also across other Western countries, and socially engineering SIM swaps so that essentially any phone calls or SMS from that point forward is going to their device and not to the original user. It kind of makes sense if you think about this context of where these guys came from, why they are so good at social engineering. That is what this is all about. And so they've simply taken that and applied that methodology and that knowledge that they've gained over time to different areas where they can push that forward. There are a number of individuals that are known by law enforcement. Other parts of this particular community that are committing cybercrime are still being actively researched and looked at by law enforcement and the intel community. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you probably can actually for the most part. But I want to draw attention to this because I think it's just a great slide to show you what a mess of attribution this is. This was actually a slide that Jake Nicastro from Mandiant presented at SleuthCon last year. It's actually available online, that presentation on YouTube. I'd highly recommend you checking it out if you're interested in this group a little bit more. It's called My Octopus Teacher, New Actors, New Problems. And he talks for the whole talk about what a mess this group is, or these groups, how individuals are moving between them, and how it really defies traditional CTI methodologies of clustering activity together. If we're talking about nation-state groups, if we're talking about Russian cyber criminal groups, it's usually pretty neat to wrap your hands around that and understand which components of that are which. These guys really defy that kind of categorization. I think the thing that I would say to everybody here is, it doesn't really matter who they are. If you look at that circle there, I've got to turn this way. Scattered spider, which is what CrowdStrike calls this particular group that we're tracking, they think that this is two groups. This is Mandiant's slide. They track this as two groups themselves. We actually track what CrowdStrike calls scattered spider as two groups as well. It's immaterial really for you guys here today. It doesn't matter. I think really what matters for network defenders is whether or not there's 1, 2, or 10 groups, what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures these guys are using, and what can you do to defend yourself against them? All right, so this is just a really brief rundown on some of the reporting that's been out there on these guys. So August 2022, that was when we first wrote our blog post about the Twilio compromise and our role in it. And that was the first time we named these guys. You can see there, CrowdStrike started reporting on them in about, I think it was December 2022. Mandiant's reported on them, giving them their own name as well. You can see Palo Alto refers to them as Muddled Libra, Microsoft Octo Tempest. These guys have gotten around. We will continue to track them the way we do, and it's a little bit of contention, I think, in circles sometimes around why different names are applied to different actors. I think for us, it's purely down to the visibility that we've got. We can't do the kind of attribution and analysis that Mandiant do. Those kind of organisations where they're doing incident response and they can look at what happens post-compromise and get a really deep understanding of that, it allows them to divide groups into clusters in a way that we simply can't. The reality is where Okta sits in the ecosystem, we are an authorization company, we are doing identity, so what we're seeing is that initial access. That's pretty much what we see unless a customer particularly gives it to us. From that point of view, we'll continue to track them the way that we do because that's based on the visibility that we have. All right, so these guys love SMS phishing, or smishing if you're familiar, or if you like that term. I personally can't stand that term, but these guys, here's some examples of some of the SMS phishing that we've seen these guys do. They're pretty prolific at it. They will send hundreds and hundreds of these to different parts of your organisation if they want to target you. They'll have done their research already to work out what part of the user population they want to go after. And then they will do OSINT, they'll use tools like Rocket Reach if you're familiar with it. Salespeople love these tools. The tools that you can use to identify who works where in a company, right? They aggregate that data together. These guys love using that data for the same reason salespeople do. They will target you users and they will send through lots of different pretexts here, right? Some of these will relate to HR type notifications, some of them will be service tickets. They've experimented with just about everything. There's a couple of examples on here that are not from ScatterSwine themselves. They're actually from that larger constellation of threat actors, if we want to call them that, but I wanted to throw them on there because I think they're interesting anyway. Two that I'll draw your attention to that I think are particularly interesting here is the YubiKey one, bottom left, second from the left, specifically asking users to remove their YubiKey. I can't think of a better advertisement for how great web authenticator keys are than a threat actor specifically asking you to remove them, so that one's great. And then if you look at the top right there, that one's interesting. The link there is pretty messy, really. It's pretty long and not that interesting, but it is interesting, actually. They've done their research there. They understand what a modern IDP auth flow looks like, and they understand the type of URLs that users are going to see. And that's a phishing link, but it directly mimics the type of sign-in URL that you're actually going to see in your web browser as you're logging into some of your applications. So they've done their research, really, is what this is about, and they understand what is going to work for them. All right, post-compromise. I feel like you could do an entire presentation just on TTPs that these guys use post-compromise. I'm going to keep it very high level for the purposes of what we're talking about here today. As I said, their initial access techniques are relatively static. These, after post-compromise, they change a lot. What I'll say is they will aggressively seek to move laterally. They'll seek out sensitive information within the target environment, and they'll look to monetize access. Cross-tenant impersonation. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because, again, I feel like you could do an entire talk about it. But essentially, this one is one that we saw in the MGM compromise. And what it really comes down to is these guys understand modern IDP solutions as well as your IDP people do. They are going to go after your identity provider, whoever that is. Once they get access to the admin to that account, they can use the legitimate features available in that identity tool to move laterally in your environment. So they're going to use some pretty fancy, some pretty high-tech techniques to avoid detection while moving laterally and taking over other accounts inside your environment. The TLDR here really is please protect those accounts. The admin to your identity provider, that's God mode in your environment. If that goes, it's game over. And then this slide here again, I don't expect you to read it, but this just gives you an idea of how prolific they are in what they do after they gain access. This is simply the 6 reports, I think it was, on the earlier slide. This is simply us mapping the techniques out of those reports to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and as you can see, it's lit up like a Christmas tree already. This doesn't even take into account any reporting that's come out about these guys in the last 12 months, which would add many, many boxes to this. So they really will throw everything at you once they've compromised. All right, these two aren't specifically about scatter swine, but I did want to call them out anyway. Again, these are tactics that we have seen used by other groups within this constellation of actors. And I think they're really interesting to look at and to think and ask yourself whether or not these would work in your environment and potentially what you could do to defend yourself. They love to abuse recovery flows. Now, if you are locked out of your work account, how do you get access back to that in your environment? In some environments, they will use a personal email address for the user as a secondary contact mechanism, and that they can initiate a password recovery flow themselves that will send a magic link to that user's email account, and then they can click on that and continue on from there. These guys are really good at this. They'll go after your employees' personal email addresses to start with, and they will compromise that, and once they've got it, they'll look to do that password reset, and that they'll basically get themselves in the middle of that auth flow for you. The other one that I'll talk a little bit about here is posing as your target security team. We've seen some pretty slick approaches here. Again, it doesn't really matter which threat actor this is. It really comes back to what do you have in place to authenticate when a security member of your organization reaches out to an employee. Can they validate that that person is really who they say they are? We've seen instances of these guys calling up employees, pretending to be the security team, telling them that they're under investigation, creating that classic social engineering thing that we know about where you're creating high pressure, you're demanding answers very quickly. And again, they're very good at this. They will know who's in your security team. They'll know some of the tools and some of the reporting mechanisms that are available. They'll use all of that in their playbook. So really what this one comes down to is how would you make sure that your users are aware of who the security people are and how they can validate that? What mechanisms can you put in place? I think this is where using your security awareness program is really important here. Maybe they can reach out to call someone in the security team to validate that this is real. In some of the examples we've seen, they've specifically stressed that this is a very sensitive investigation and they shouldn't talk to anyone else in the organisation. Kind of feel like, as a parent talking to my kids here, saying nobody who says keep this secret is someone that you should listen to. If anyone tells you keep this secret and don't tell anyone, maybe you should tell someone about that. Come to me and tell me about it. I think we can probably start to tell our employees the same thing. All right. I talked a little bit about this one already, so I won't stay too much on it. But like I said, we have certain visibility into our customers' environments. We don't get to see what happens after you log in. That's not where we play in the ecosystem. So our visibility is dictated by the type of things that are done on a customer's IDP. We did some research that I want to talk to you about here today. And we set ourselves a hypothesis. We said organisations targeted by prolific phishing actors are more likely to enrol users in phishing-resistant authenticators, and we set out to see whether or not this was true or not. Before I go into this research, I do want to talk to you a little bit about some definitions that we've got here. First of all, targeted organisation. That is an organisation that we saw targeted by this particular threat actor, Scatterswine. I want to really make it clear, targeted here does not mean compromised. Many of these were just a rattle of the doorknob. But they are, every single one of these customers, we track this threat actor very closely, and when we see customers targeted, we actually notify them directly and let them know that they're being targeted. So these companies are aware that they were targeted. Phishing-resistant authenticators. So we're using the definition that NIST sets here in their standard. According to NIST, phishing resistance requires that a channel be authenticated that is cryptographically bound to the output of the authenticator. In more simple terms, this means that the domain that the website you are signing into is tied to your authenticator to ensure that your authenticator won't issue your credentials to fake phishing sites. Examples of this include Okta's FastPass, FIDO2, WebAuthn, passkeys or hardware keys. and PIV CAC smart cards. User enrolment. So we define this as the percentage of users in an organisation that has phishing resistance authenticators. Really important to understand this data I'm going to show you in a minute is to understand that it's easy to have over 100% enrolment in authenticators. If every user in your account has more than one WebAuthn authenticator, you are going to have at least 200%, right? So you will see those numbers on this graph. That's what that means. And specifically, we drew a line in the sand and we said, let's look at the rates from immediately before being targeted by these guys to a current state as of March 2024. All right, so let me explain this a little bit. It might take a little bit moment for this to click, so let me take you through it. The next two charts will show you some candlestick slides. Before we go through that, let's talk about what it means. On the top of the blue candlestick, it represents the enrolment rate in phishing-resistant authenticators as of March 2024 at the end of our study. So the top of the blue bar is where they end up. The bottom of the bar is what percentage of enrolment they had prior to being targeted. So that date can vary. The empty candlesticks are the reverse of this. There is a couple of examples on this chart, and it's not real research until you see some results that just make no sense to you. In this case, we actually did see a couple of customers that rolled backwards. They actually went backwards. Honestly, I can't tell you why that happened. It's not something that we've dug into that much, but it is rare. All right. Hopefully that's legible. I'll take you through a little bit about what it means in a moment. The vertical axis here is the percentage of users enrolled in phishing-resistant authenticators. The horizontal axis, you can see there are 35 organisations that have obviously been anonymised that were targeted by ScatterSwine over this 2-year period, and these are in sequential order. So number 1 was targeted all the way back in 2022, 35 was targeted not that long ago. A few observations that we'd make here. Very few organisations, only 3 on this graph, took no action at all. Again, like I said, I can't tell you why. It's not something we've directly talked to those organisations about. I would surmise if you look at number 9 and number 23, they probably deployed security keys to their privileged users and didn't roll them out to everyone in the organisation. That's a pretty legitimate use case depending on what your threat model looks like. Many of the organisations targeted back in 2022 went from very little phishing resistance to 100%. Since then, you'll see multiple customers literally doubling down on phishing resistance, with enrolment rates well in advance of 100%. The most recent cluster on the right-hand side have gone from super low user enrolment through to very high, and they've done it very quickly. Anecdotally, these tend to be organisations that protected their privileged users with YubiKeys and have now rolled out FastPass to all of their users. So what does all this data mean? Our hypothesis is largely correct. Most of the time, organisations take action once they've seen the threat firsthand. And they take an all-or-nothing approach to phishing resistance, with many of them rolling out FastPass plus WebAuthn or multiple WebAuthn authenticators. OTP generators are the most displaced factors that we saw. So the median user enrolment rate for these organisations was already 2 times higher than the average Okta customer before they were targeted. There's a bit of context here. This threat actor loves going after tech companies. They are more likely to use stronger authenticators from the outset. Once they were targeted by ScatterSwine, the median enrolment jumped up to 95%. That's something like a 900% higher than the average Okta customer. For those of you who prefer averages, the average enrolment rate was 50% prior to these attacks, rising to 91% after the attack. So this is interesting. What you're seeing here is some telemetry from inside one of our internal tools here at Okta. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Again, it's pretty legible. What authenticators are they replacing with phishing-resistant alternatives? Most often, like I said, they're replacing MFA factors that use OTPs, one-time passwords. SMS and authenticator apps are the most common that they're replacing here. They're easily socially engineerable. There's no mechanism in place to stop someone from grabbing that information and putting it into their own login, be that on a phone call or be that on a phishing site. Now, if you rely on the public narrative around phishing resistance, there's only one game in town, and that's FIDO2. We love FIDO2 at Okta. We use it for keys, for hardware keys for enrolment and recovery flows internally. But there's some interesting observations that we came up with here. In many cases, an organisation with strong WebAuthn adoption has gradually been rolling out larger numbers of users in Okta FastPass. Okta FastPass is a passwordless phishing-resistant authentication method built on the client application Okta Verify. Users run this client on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, iOS. Each of these graphs is from a single org from our data set of the 35. In the last 30 days, a lot of these orgs have swung heavily to FastPass. The red line represents FIDO2 authenticators. Usually, you're talking about hardware keys here. And the brown line represents the use of Okta FastPass. I think probably the most graphic of these is the bottom left one, where you can see that they had almost a linear decrease from a one-to-one relationship between their FIDO2 keys going down and Okta FastPass going up there. And this is some data from across the Okta platform. Like I said, I will stress here that on average, and in aggregate, phishing resistance factors were the most likely to be replaced were the OTPs. But there's still an interesting question to ask here. Why are very capable organisations with low tolerance for risk adding FastPass to a user population already protected by WebAuthn? The graph here that you're seeing is across all Okta workforce customers, and you're seeing the monthly active users of FastPass versus WebAuthn. It's great to see them both going up, but it surprised us, to be frank, to see FastPass going up that quickly. So why is that? I think there's a better together story here. Both FastPass and WebAuthn will deny requests from an adversary in the middle phishing proxy, but WebAuthn, by its nature and how it was designed, is designed for and optimized for privacy and anonymity. Okta FastPass can give your security team more insight into what's actually going on. A key differentiator is that when a failed login to a phishing site is detected by Okta FastPass, it'll create a server-side detection for your security teams to act on. It's hard to take any defensive measures or know that you're being targeted if you're not getting any alerting at all. FastPass can also be used to collect signals around the management state and security posture of the device. Is this a device that's enrolled in your environment? Do you know about it or not? It's up to you to decide what applications you want that to apply to. It's pretty powerful, actually. You can decide that certain applications have to come from a managed device, others can only be coming from anywhere that you want them to. Furthermore, if your authentication policy is evaluating a device condition, FastPass will probe the device for signals every time the user requests a new application during a session. And that's a pretty handy way to defeat token theft and replay of sessions. At Okta now, we're getting the best of both worlds. Remember how we talked about user enrollment flows and just trying to get in the middle of them? What we've done here at Okta now is when we enroll a new user, we pre-enroll the user with a physical FIDO2 security key, and Yubico ships that key to the user's home address. The user is then sent their device, usually a MacBook, directly to that address separately. The user is then emailed a passcode for that key, and the managed device is configured to require the first authentication to use that security key. There's pretty much no way to get into the middle of this unless you're going to sit at the mailbox. As soon as the user signs in, they're asked to enroll in Okta FastPass, which becomes their primary built-in phishing-resistant passwordless authenticator. And the user can then put that FIDO key in a safe place as a backup should anything happen to go wrong with their Verify client or they need to enroll another device in the future. So this is actually thanks to a partnership between Okta and Yubico that delivers this service, and it's actually available to Okta customers as well. So definitely worth thinking about if you happen to be in that ecosystem. All right, a few last things to talk about here. We had a look at the data to see if we could answer any other questions around configuration and what made these type of customers unique. In general, what we can say is that these customers were more likely to use security-related features and have a maturity in their use of Okta. Okta Workflows is a no-code automation solution that we have in our product suite for premium customers. That SKU allows a lot of the use cases there are security-related workflows, so it makes sense that customers that are more preoccupied with security are making more use of that. 88% of users have threat insight in log and enforce mode. This is a tool that we use internally to identify IP addresses that are likely taking part in credential abuse, password stuffing, DDoS attacks, and things like that. To my disappointment personally, a lot of customers are worried about using that tool, and they only use it in log mode so that it's not actively defending them. Definitely we're seeing a much higher use of that in these customers that are being targeted. And then 91% of these organizations access Okta logs programmatically. That's a fancy way to saying that they're probably ingesting their logging into a SIEM. Again, pretty depressing that a lot of companies don't do that. I mean, it's worth considering that some of our customers are very, very large, but we also have some very small customers as well who don't necessarily have a dedicated security team and a SIEM. But in this case, you can see that a lot of them are doing that. All right, so getting towards the end now, here's our recommendations. Simply put, phishing resistance authentication will deliver some of the best bang for buck for your security program that you can possibly get. And if you're an Okta customer, FastPass is available in all SKUs. This is not a capability reserved for premium customers. 3 through 5 there you can see, we've actually just highlighted here, there is an additional cost for some of these features of things that you can set up for yourself. But we do highlight and show there that FastPass is compelling. It's easier to use and faster. It is a passwordless solution, and a lot of our customers are loving it. There's one final observation I'd like to make. Most of Scattered Spider's targets so far have been US-based firms. We've talked a bit about that already. But I'd like to caution you into thinking that this is something we don't need to be worried about here in Australia. I'd encourage you to think of the techniques that we've talked about today as a class of attacks, and one that is only going to grow given how effective they are. This is not an Okta-centric threat. This is something we all need to think about, especially as companies continue to modernise their corporate environments and we continue to roll out more and more remote work. In terms of this particular threat actor, we are aware of instances where they've opportunistically targeted Australian organisations, so it's not exclusively an American problem. And you can also find yourself potentially impacted by these guys if they were to compromise, say, an MSP or a SaaS company that you work with. All right. I'd like to really thank you for your time here today. If you'd like to chat further with me or the team, I'm actually going to wander down to our booth in the hall in a moment and spend the next hour or so there. We're also giving away money to 2 very deserving, awesome charities. If you come by, you can help decide how you'd like to divide up that funding. And finally, I want to leave you with a link here to our Secure Sign-ins Trends Report. If you're looking to make a business case on using phishing-resistant authentication in your organisation, I'd highly recommend you to give this a look if you haven't seen it yet. This is an anonymised study of all Okta orgs looking at trends in use of various factors. The authors did a great research in showing how much faster it is to authenticate using passwordless phishing-resistant authenticators. This tends to be depressingly, a stronger business case than simply talking about the security benefits alone. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Can certainly agree, phishing-resistant MFA is a very good user experience, and that is unfortunately kind of the best way to get people over the line. Bit short on time, so I'm just going to ask just one of these questions.
Sure.
How you were tracking scattered swine, how you were actually able to track which of the customers were attacked even when they weren't specifically impacted?
Yeah, it's a great question. Might wander back over here. So a lot of our insight comes from monitoring the phishing infrastructure that these guys are setting up. This was a capability we built internally a number of years ago, mainly to protect ourselves. What phishing sites were being set up to target Okta and our employees. As a byproduct of that, if you're familiar with Okta enough, you'll see when you log on, you're going to get a site that declares that it's Okta, and it's going to have the customer's name, your name on that logon screen. So for us, we can start to say, all right, they're targeting this particular company, that particular company, etc. So a lot of our insight comes directly from observing the phishing infrastructure itself. looking at the phishing kits that they're using, sometimes pulling those apart and understanding where the credentials are getting sent back to, what infrastructure they're setting them up with, what domains they're registering and where those registrars are. And we're able to use that information to cluster together some insight on what these guys are doing and what they're going after.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Can I get one more round of applause? Tim, thank you.
Thank you very much.